You're watching PBS.
Ancestors, with hosts Jim and Terry Willard.
Increasing numbers of African Americans have had success at uncovering their roots, in spite of the challenges created by their unique and often painful history in America.
Today we'll visit with a genealogist who has helped many African Americans succeed in their search for family history.
But first, let's visit Colette DeVerge, whose search for family history started with a chance meeting in Africa and continues with the support of friends in South Central Los Angeles.
I didn't know how to do it. I had no idea that people were doing it. I mean, like I said, I didn't know anything about genealogy. I didn't even know that the word existed. I had nobody to talk to. Everybody that I talked to, family members, they would give me some information, but when I would try to discuss it a little bit further, or get into other groups and discuss it with people like my friends, nobody was really interested because they said everybody I was talking about was dead, and nobody was interested in talking about the dead. I love Africa, and since I'm a Black American and cannot identify with what ethnic group I came from, my goal is to see as much of Africa as I can. I was with some girls I had gone to school with, and we were kind of just visiting different places where they had family members, and we had gone to Spain, we had been in Turkey, and a couple of other places. And I said, you know, I've been following you guys all around, and my friends were all white. I was the only Black. So I've been following you all around. We should go to Africa. We've been where all your parents have come from, but we haven't gone to Africa. And we said, okay, let's go to the airport and get us a ticket and go to Africa. And that's what we did. But when we got there, they wanted to know, where do you want to go in Africa? And I said, I don't know, Africa. I met Alex Haley the very first time in Gambia at the time that they were there researching to do the movie Roots. And I had a chance to talk to him, and during this conversation, I told him about some of my family members, and he told me that I should pursue the family history. And he also told me where I could go to start getting information. He explained to me that you could go into the research libraries, you should talk to your different family members to get as much information as you can, and write everything down. So it was little things like that, little bits and pieces of information like that that he had given me that really pushed me to get out there, to go into the libraries and actually start the research. My research has been stop and go from the beginning. There have been times I've gotten frustrated because I couldn't find certain information. And I've stopped, but prior to that, I think initially the problem was the fact that I did not know how to research. And once I got some information or some type of direction, it kind of pushed me along. I also joined a genealogical society. The society that I belong to, California African American Genealogical Society, and it was formed in 1986 here in Los Angeles. Our meetings are held each month on the third Saturday of the month, and they're held at Martin Luther King Junior Methodist Church in South Central Los Angeles.
It is kind of ironic that people look at South Central Los Angeles and think, wow, this is just a riot going on all the time. But it's not. There are families here in South Central Los Angeles, right here in this church, Martin Luther King Church. And here is where we have learned how to do genealogy, that is opening doors for us, that is letting us understand who we are and why we exist.
In school, we studied history, but I wanted to know like my own family history. And so my mom started taking me to the library and everything when I was about 8. And ever since I've been doing my research, and I've gone back really far.
And the next thing I knew, I wanted to know who everybody was. If I could get back to Eve, it would be fine.
I was mesmerized, and I just thought, wow, that would be the greatest thing outside of finding the one person that you should marry would be to find your own roots and discover what your grandparents' lives were like and what their parents' lives were like.
We were not counted as people before a certain period. So that stems from some of us believing that there is no history. So we don't find it. As in my case, I didn't think I should go past the oral history that was given to me. So I found no need to search. But now that I've found other people who are searching and have found, I'm now interested.
And a person can call you all kind of names, but you know where you came from. And if you don't know where you came from, then you should join a genealogy group like this and find out.
My ancestors, of course, are family members, and they're people personally that I want to know where they were at a certain point, where they died, who they were married to. I would just like to know something about their life. And I hope after I'm gone, somebody feels the same, way about me.
I did want to try to validate some of the oral stories that had been passed down from my mother's side and my father's side.
My mother is labeled as being the family's oral historian. And she basically said, well, you'd better get busy and try to document some of this information because I'm not going to be with you that much longer, and I know everything there is to know about everybody.
There are a lot of challenges. You'll find the biggest one comes from your family. They're all congenital liars, every one of them. Everything that they tell you has a kernel of truth.
I began to ask some of my father's sisters, where are your parents? What happened to them? How did they die?
The records are there. We speak of records being segregated, but the records are there. We just have to keep looking for them.
And I found them in the 1880 census. And when I saw them, all I could do was sit there and cry.
When I started genealogy, although I started with my father's side of the family simply because that was my family name, I must have worked on his side for about 6 months, and I was really successful. In fact, the very first time that I went into the library and pulled out the census and started looking at the 1870 census, and that's the one that blacks were listed by name, the very first census that blacks were listed by name on, I was very lucky that I found family members' names that I had been given. I found them within like 10 minutes of starting to look for them. I was running through that microfilm. It was like these people were saying, here I am, almost literally jumping off of the pages. It was so many family members and so many names. And like I said, it was people that I'd heard about. I'm Mandy Green and my grandmother Melinda and my great-grandfather, then my grandfather, to see his name like on the next census that came out. A lot of these people, they were dead before I was even born. So this is the closest I can come to them. And then the other people who I knew, it's like, they were kids. You imagine somebody that you knew at 80 years old, and here they are on a census report at age 6. It's just amazing to me.
I subsequently found that my family had been in California since 1851 or 52. And so for that reason, then, I wanted to investigate this and find out how they got here, what was their status. This was during the days of slavery.
That our family had the strength of spirit to be able to survive something that I don't know if I could ever live through.
Why do you talk about slavery? That's over. Well, my answer is that it isn't over in the sense that it had a very long-lasting effect. It has helped to determine how black people see each other. It has helped to determine how black people see white people, and it certainly has influenced the way white people see black people.
After I talked to Alex Haley, I had gone back to Senegal, and we went to Gorée Island. And in going to Gorée Island, to hear from the curator there at the museum the stories of what went on in Gorée Island. There were a lot of slaves that were held there. A lot of them were held there because they had to be force-fed. They needed to weigh a certain amount in order to be placed on slave ships to make the journey to the Americas. And that was the last transpoint as far as West Africa was, because it was the closest point to the United States. And the thing that impacted me the most was when they told how they split up the families. Like there were a family of 3 or 4. The mother would go to Brazil. The father would be sent to Cuba. One of the children might be sent to Jamaica, and one of the other children would be sent to the Americas, or to the United States. So they would know that they would have no way of ever getting together again. I had walked away from the group, and a couple of people were saying, we're going in this direction. I said, yeah, I know, I'll catch up with you. I finally walked up, and someone came along and said, do you know where you're standing? And I said, no, I just wanted to get a better view because it was high. And when I walked up a couple more steps, he said, well, you're standing on the auction block. I don't know, I never felt like that before. It was like, basically, you could hear voices. At one point, I felt like I had been there before. Now I know why I'm always running around all over the country and like to travel. Why I had a couple of relatives who were traveling all the time. I mean, even as slaves, they were always running off someplace, so it's in my genes. There's nothing I can do about it. I also know, and I especially understand by doing genealogy, that if the things did not go on and that everything did not happen exactly the way that it happened, I would not be sitting here talking today.
Tony, tell us how you got started in genealogy.
Well, it actually happened when I was in college. I was attending a lecture that happened to be given by the late Alex Haley. And I was very fascinated about his story, and I said, wow, I'd like to do that one day before I die. And it happened 6 years later. I was reading a newspaper article, and it was about doing genealogy and about a book that you can get. And I thought, and I said, wow, I remember Alex talked about that. So I ran out and I got the book, and I started reading it. Then I talked to my mom, talked to my dad, my grandparents, and then I got hooked. So you know, it's a lot of fun.
Once the bug bites.
Yeah.
So far, what we've encouraged our viewers is that starting genealogy, you always start with yourself, and you work back in time, one generation at a time.
Sure.
You interview your older family members. You start getting information down on the pedigree and the family group records. And of course, sooner or later, you get to records and start filling in the gaps. In doing African-American genealogy, is there any major difference there at all?
Well, we use similar records, but because of our unique experiences here in the United States, because of racism and segregation, we have to take a slightly different approach when we do genealogy. We do start with ourselves and work backward, and the main thing that we really want to do is get the oral history from our relatives. So I can never stress that too much by talking to their older relatives. In fact, in my class, I have my students make a list of all their living relatives and interview everyone before you go out to do any type of research. Once you go into the library, you have to know a little bit about Black history and the history of African Americans here in this country, because the records are going to reflect that experience here. Looking at it from a genealogical strategy point of view, you always start with yourself and proceed backward, like you have mentioned. And we're talking about 3 distinct time periods in history. We're talking about the history of segregation, which right precedes us. Before then, we get into the period of Reconstruction right after the Civil War. And then prior to then, we're getting into the slavery period. And each period has its own set of unique circumstances.
What's the time frame for this period you're referring to, the segregation?
Well, segregation legally ended around 1954 with the Brown versus Topeka decision. And then the civil rights movement and struggle that followed afterward. So again, in doing genealogy, starting with ourselves and moving backward into time, you know, it doesn't take long to get to 1954, okay? And either ourselves or our parents or our grandparents definitely lived through that particular period. But that takes us back to at least to the turn of the century and even before the turn of the century.
If an African American were beginning to do the research and they tie into this period of segregation, what are some of the records they're going to run into?
One of the first groups of records you want to think about are vital records. Things like birth certificates, death certificates, and marriage licenses. I have some examples here, particularly from Alabama, where you see that here's a listing of births, deaths, and marriages, but you see here that many of them are segregated by race. So if you're not aware of that, you can send for a record or look for a record and not find your ancestors there, and not knowing that the records were actually segregated.
Does that mean when I go to the courthouse or when I write to them, I would have to specify that?
Sometimes you should. Yes. Sometimes the clerks know, sometimes they don't. But if you know there was definitely an African American, then you would want to tell them that this was an African American so they could check that particular index.
What other sources should people be looking for?
One of the things that was very helpful for me was using city directories. City directories were just like telephone directories, but before the telephone was invented. So they're very easy to use, and I tell my students, let your fingers do the walking. So again, an example from Spartanburg, when I first started to utilize the city directory, I didn't find my ancestors in there, and then I realized that the reason I didn't find them was the fact that they were in the back of the book, kind of like riding the back of the bus. Okay, so once I re-examined the city directory, I found out that the whites were in the front of the book and the coloreds were in the rear of the book. So once I went to the rear and went through the colored department, then I found my ancestors listed in the directory. Speaking of vital records, another record that is available are lynchings that happened in the United States. This is a very dark, painful period of our past, but it's something we cannot gloss over and forget and neglect about. A number of my students in my class had told me that some of their ancestors had been lynched and asked specifically, were there any records of lynchings? Well, I found a book by Ralph Ginsberg that's titled 100 Years of Lynchings. And this book documents 5,000 lynchings in the United States. So someone can use this if they heard that an ancestor was lynched and find out the exact circumstances of when it happened and where it happened.
That certainly seems as though that would be an oral tradition that would exist within a family. If something that traumatic had happened in a family, it would have been passed on. So
sometimes it was and sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was so painful and the whole family had to move. That's why some people moved from the south to the north to get away from the lynchings. So in that situation, when an African American would sit down with their parents or grandparents and ask them about the family history, sometimes, you know, they didn't say anything. And it's hard for us to figure out why. Well, sometimes that reason was the fact that someone in the family had gotten lynched and the memory was so painful it was kind of repressed.
You're working back through time. You've worked back through the segregation period. What next?
Well, what some people do is they pick up on the census records, and then they take the census records and they can find their ancestors straight back, and then they try to get into the slavery period. Or they've heard from the oral history that one of their ancestors were slaves. Well, even though you might know that one of your ancestors were slaves, you don't have enough information to run off and start researching slave records. And you really don't have enough information to really start researching slaves on the census records. You need to stop for a moment and go through the Reconstruction period. Reconstruction followed the Civil War in 1865. And they say it's Reconstruction because the country was in the midst of a war. The country was divided. Now we've got to put it back together. We've also got former slaves that are now free. They need services and they need assistance. So there were many government agencies set up to try to make the transition from slavery into freedom. So there's a rich source of records during this particular period. There were bank records. There were letters sent for people trying to find their relatives. There was a whole agency called the Freedmen's Bureau that was set up. The technical name is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And their job was to assist former slaves, but it was also to assist refugees who were fleeing from the war.
So this is the period of time, Reconstruction. What comes as we start with ourselves and work back? What do we move into from there?
Well, once you move back to there, you'd want to look at records from the U.S. colored troops, which were blacks that fought during the Civil War. And I think you had a section on military records where you talked about Civil War research. Once you finish that, then you're actually ready to look into the slavery period. But one thing that researchers need to be aware of, all African Americans were not slaves. There were many freed African Americans prior to the Civil War in the North as well as in the South. There were hundreds of thousands of freed African Americans in the South. So you need to try to make some kind of determination if your ancestors were slave or they were free.
And if they were free, would their records be in civil records?
Yes, actually, they would. So you would research on similar veins as everyone else did. You go to the census records and go to the other vital and county records. It's important to know the slave owner because when you look at records, slaves were considered property. So there are no actual records listed by the slave's name. So you won't be able to go to records and actually look for your ancestor's name directly. Also, slaves were not recognized by surnames. So they were only listed in most of the records by first names. So since they were considered property and you can't look for them directly, you have to look to the records of the slave owner. And then some of those would list the name of his slaves, which would be your ancestors.
And those would be records like wills, deeds, and mortgages, that kind of record?
Right, exactly.
This sounds like an incredible task, almost discouraging.
Well, there's a lot of genealogical societies that have sprung up within the last 10 to 15 years, and making an alliance with one of the genealogical societies can really help, because there's been developing quite a number of African American genealogists that have some experience that can really help people out and kind of show them some of the ropes. They have meetings on a regular basis.
So if a person is beginning African American genealogy, would they be able to go to a local? Are there some really some local ones where they could get some help to start?
Oh, sure, absolutely. In fact, there's a number of them in most of the major cities around the country, and it's a matter of when you go to the library, oftentimes they're listed in the guides to genealogical associations, genealogical societies. So there's, fairly easy to get in contact with.
I know one thing, and I don't want to put you on the spot.
Sure.
Everything we've looked at, the potential to come face to face with a lot of pain and a lot of anger. How can you deal with that?
Well, it's not always easy. It's sometimes very, very difficult, especially when you find the name of your ancestor, and you might find out that he was a slave, might have been beaten, might have had his family split up. Sometimes it's very painful. But I think we get a richer, deeper understanding of our family and also of history, so we can place things into context. I think it also lets you understand what we're going through today and what we've been through, and hopefully that will help us tomorrow.
The healing power of genealogy.
Yes, exactly.
If I can just summarize in a nutshell,
Sure.
obviously we want to start with ourselves, work backward in time, one generation at a time, interview the older family members, start writing this down, start doing pedigree charts, family group records, turn to the records. And here's, and what I really hear, and it's wonderful to hear, you've got to have a good sense of black history, you have to have a good sense of American history.
Exactly.
Go through the period of segregation. Remember that even today, even in the advent of civil rights, the records are still segregated. You have to remember that division is there. Work back into the period of Reconstruction, into the Civil War, and then into the slavery period.
Exactly.
Be patient.
Exactly.
Persevere.
Exactly.
It's a challenge, but it's worth it.
Exactly.
Tony, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. It's been a very, very great pleasure dealing with you today.
Thank you. It's really been enjoyable for me, too. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great.
We've learned today from Tony and Colette that African American genealogy can be challenging, but also very rewarding.
Keep in mind the following tips.
First, start with yourself and work back from there, one generation at a time.
Second, interview your oldest living relatives for family history stories.
Third, a good knowledge of African American history will help you in your search.
Many cities across the country have African American genealogical or historical societies that can help you get started. You can also visit the Ancestors homepage.
Thanks for being with us, and please join us for the next episode of Ancestors.
To learn more about Ancestors, visit us at PBS Online at the internet address on your screen.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support ancestors.